All right. I think it's about that time. It's 11 a.m. Eastern. So we are going to go ahead and get started. I see some folks continuing to file in, um, and that's perfectly fine. But we'll go ahead and get rolling, and folks can catch up as they sit down, as it were. Um, so welcome everybody to the July installment of the Accelerant Research Virtual Insights Conference. My name is Bill McDowell. I'm COO of Accelerant Research, and I'm going to be your host for today's festivities. Quick overview of these conferences and what to expect. So basically, we've got essentially just a series of hour-long virtual webinars from some really good insights pros that are going to happen throughout the day. So every hour on the hour, we're going to do a new topic, a new speaker, and we're going to get started in just a few with our first guest, who is Liz Casals from Lincoln Financial Group. I'm going to be your MC, like I said. I'm not going to talk for very long. That's not what we're here for. So I am just going to give a quick kind of overview. This is now, gosh, we started these virtual conferences back at the beginning of shutdown last year. We've had several folks that have joined us for several waves of our events. Other folks who are brand new. So for their benefit, we'll just give a quick overview and rundown of what this is all about. And we like to operate with a few pretty simple ground rules. Number one being we're at the mercy of tech. We've got some folks that are starting to head back to the office. I myself am back in Accelerant's office, but we've got a lot of presenters, a lot of attendees who are still remote, still logging in from the living room, bedroom, you name it. And we're at the mercy of whatever tech grid platform usage, kids in the background, dogs barking, delivery people, you name it. We just ask to be patient, right? We're all in this together. We're all subject to the same interruptions and craziness. So we're not going to, promise a perfectly polished, wonderful presentation and show. Accelerant Research is a research agency. We're not an event planning or conference organization. We are not going to apologize for anything that's a little bit less than, completely polished. No, what we have is a group of really good speakers talking shop, sharing their own expertise in the insights industry, and allowing us to kind of follow along, right? So we're excited to have that and to get started. Second rule that we have along those lines is be respectful. Because of the virtual nature of this conference, we're not in person. You don't run the risk of bumping into someone in the buffet line. So there is at times the kind of anonymity that folks can draw off of, and the temptation to potentially troll. Avoid that. It's not something that we've really had to deal with, but just keep in mind, these folks are volunteering their time, so be respectful. But that's not to say that you shouldn't ask smart questions. Push back at times. Everybody that we have on our presenter roster is, these are research and insights folks. So we're used to having to defend the findings that we share and the things that we're talking about. So, there's no harm in asking challenging questions. Just, again, avoid the trolling. Third rule is, to the extent possible, this is a virtual conference. We're not in person, but as much as you can, try to network, engage, interact with one another, not just our presenters, but even other audience members. If you're logged into the Zoom webinar, you have the chat function, you have the Q&A function that you can interact with, but we've also got folks that are logging in from other touch points. We've got YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter that you may be accessing via, and we ask that if you are on these social platforms, use the hashtag ARVIC. That'll help us sort of wrangle and keep track of any chatter that's happening out there. Introduce yourself to one another, talk amongst yourselves, to the extent possible, shake hands virtually. Yeah, let's make it as engaging as possible, right? All right, so we've got a good lineup of speakers today. We're going to start off with Liz Casals from Lincoln Financial Group at 11 o'clock, which is right now. So I'm going to spend just a couple more minutes for going through our roster. We've got our 12 o'clock speaker, which is going to be Dr. Chihan Chobonolu. Apologies if I butchered that. He's going to be talking to us about crowdsourcing platforms for market and academic research. Coming in at 1 p.m. is going to be Christian Kurtz from Viacom, giving us an overview of a talk called Beyond 2020, Global Youth Voices and Futures. And we're going to finish the day with Sean Good from Jane.com, batting cleanup and talking about democratizing research without jeopardizing your job. So I think we've got a really, really neat and compelling list of speakers, some diverse industries and diverse topics, but I think, all subjects that we as research and insight pros can, find great value in. So that's it for me. I'm going to kind of step off. I'm going to let Liz Casals get rolling with her talk. I'm going to hang out to lead Q&A, but you're not here to see me, so I'm going to shut down and let Liz do her thing.
Thank you so much, Bill. So while Bill and I do our swap here, I just want to give a big shout out to Bill and his team. We are so appreciative at Lincoln for this opportunity and this forum to be sharing what we do and have the opportunity to collaborate and meet with kind of other industry practitioners, I think, to kind of share what we're learning really and really learn from each other. And so I'm excited to share kind of our journey over the last 2 years to adapt and adopt an Agile research toolkit. But I want to start today with a story of how we came to that journey. And I don't want to date myself, but my research career has spanned kind of the better part of the last 3 decades. And for many of you who have been in and around research during that time, I've had the privilege, I've worked on the vendor side, living through the transition of market research from phones to online to mobile devices. I worked on the tech development side, to develop do-it-yourself research tools. And right now I'm navigating what I find to be sometimes treacherous path, right, from small data to big data. So I'm a researcher who's open to change. I like to try new things. I like to innovate methods. I really like driving continuous improvement, both in process and cost efficiency. So 3 years ago, I had a fantastic opportunity to move from Lincoln's B2B sales and marketing organization to lead our enterprise consumer insights function. And I did what any good researcher would do. I sat down and I interviewed my customers to understand their perceptions, their needs, their challenges as it relates to the work that they did with this team. And the message that came through loud and clear was not new. And quite frankly, any researcher who lived through the changes over the last decade has heard the business complaint at some point that research takes too long, costs too much, and doesn't have the impact on decision making that it should. Not new, but it still hurts to be sitting on the other side of the desk of a senior leader or a C-level leader and hear these messages. And so knowing that I had a lot of catch up to do on the latest and greatest in kind of consumer research after taking a nearly 10-year hiatus, kind of focusing on the B2B decision maker, I dug in. And what I found was an awful lot of buzz about Agile research. And now I started my career in Silicon Valley and spent a number of years working in consumer technology and IT. So I was very familiar with Agile, right? And Agile development processes. But when I landed at Lincoln in 2013, a centuries old insurance company, right, that provides long-term guarantees and commitments to its customers, I knew I had traveled back in time. I wasn't quite sure where I had landed. It took me a little bit, lots of conversations with peers and colleagues, but I had suspected that I had landed somewhere in the early 1980s, where mainframe computers were still maintained to administer insurance policies sold and in force, since the 60s and 70s. So I was really heartened when Agile and the technology transformation imperative finally arrived at Lincoln. And so it was timely and it was appropriate to use that buzzword as a way to transform thinking and perceptions about the value that my team could bring to an organization that was committed to a journey to bridge the gap with the customer. And so one of the reasons I like this quote, it was one of the first things that had come up as I started to research, right, was, this issue of speed, right, wasn't, like I said, wasn't new, but it was the real trade-off, right, that we as consultants, first and foremost, had to make to say, is the certain and answer what's needed? Or is it the directional guidance and input and representation of the consumer kind of in the process, what's needed? So to really evaluate, right, the level, of urgency, right? The urgency versus certainty is what stands out to me as I kind of embarked on this journey. But what is Agile research, right? There wasn't a pat definition. There wasn't something, out there that somebody could explain to me, like, okay, what do I need to do to start doing this Agile research? The reality is there isn't a defined set of methodologies or approaches, or even one way to think about it. The best way that I have learned to describe it is faster. Right? Ways to keep up with the pace of innovation and decision making. And so the lowest hanging fruit were, of course, faster data collection methods, which have been around a while, nothing new there, but they remain a really important part of our toolkit. Things like omnibus studies, polling, do-it-yourself surveys with Qualtrics. We're doing more of those than ever. But Agile vendors, like work that we do with Accelerant and other partners, where we have worked and partnered quite successfully to kind of reduce timelines and speed to deliverable. On the other kind of end of the spectrum is what I referenced earlier, right? It's big data. It's leveraging technology and advanced analytics to kind of understand behavioral insights. And while that's still a very emergent area at Lincoln and I know many other companies, it obviously gets us to a lot faster, deeper insights when we can operationalize those models and those processes. But what I'm going to focus on today really is in this middle bucket here, which is faster research processes, and where a lot of new startup technology companies are upending kind of the research process as we know it, and removing friction, right, from the most common research problems, namely finding the right target audience, collecting the data and analyzing and reporting the results. So through my research and working with various industry partners, I quickly came up to speed on a growing ecology of Agile platform providers, and these are mainly tech startups focused on solving the research problem for non-researchers. And if you remember where we started this discussion, these solutions kind of focus on speed, cost efficiency, and on-demand insight to kind of drive decision-making in real time. So now if you're from the IT world, or you're from a background in UX or usability research, or even CX management, some of these tools may look really familiar to you. This is a space that's rapidly evolving. There's lots of M&A activity, VC-funded expansions, and kind of an ever-evolving capability set. But after implementing 2 of these platforms just 2 years ago, we're back in the market conducting an updated evaluation because of how quickly that landscape is emerging. But what I'm going to focus on today is, not so much the tools themselves, but rather what journey we've been through to adapt traditional market research processes to the Agile Toolkit. And so this was an image that I came across early in my research from the folks over at CEB, now Gartner. And you can see that I updated it because timelines for quick turn research have continued to compress in the 3 years since I started this journey. But what I think this illustrates well is the shift from the research mindset, which is, as I describe it, an investment in a process, a methodology that will deliver robust, in-depth, or statistically significant results, to an experimentation mindset, one that involves trial and error, repetition, directionality, iteration, and where the standard isn't statistical significance, but whether or not those insights are good enough to help drive day-to-day decisions that ultimately have real impact on consumer value and experience. And this is something that, as a decades-long researcher, really appealed to me because, you can often get caught up, and I am the type of personality that, is very interested, as many of, of the folks who come from a vendor background, our salt is doing it right? Getting the methodology right, getting the sampling right, knowing that you've measured, variance and or error, in an accurate and complete way. So to a certain extent, this felt foreign, but at the same time was very liberating. And for me, it really kind of stepped into that zone of, what is good enough, right? Good enough to help inform a decision that otherwise would not have leveraged any research or consumer insight to drive towards its ultimate end. And that became a really important distinction, differentiation, kind of qualification for when we would consider these approaches. So what does it all look like in practice? We looked for platforms that would give us, both qualitative and quantitative capabilities. And these vendors came to us. I can't take credit for bringing them, into Lincoln, because they came to us through our innovation teams, who were already using them to manage their idea pipelines. And so we looked to use them to start addressing business questions, problems that weren't using any research at all because of the perception that research simply didn't fit into the development process. And so we started with, really low-hanging fruit with things like marketing content, and then we moved on to things like product concept testing. And more recently, we've leveraged, this toolkit to tackle a market opportunity assessment, really supporting a $30 million business case. But how we've done that, how we've integrated it, how we've into a broader toolkit, and how we have developed hybrid approaches and research methods coming out of all of this has been where the real learning has taken place, certainly for me as a researcher. So just to give you a very quick idea of what comes out of the box with a platform like this, as I said, these tools were built for non-researchers, product managers, UX, CX practitioners, folks for whom insight is core to their job function, but who perhaps are less concerned with the research process as I described it. So what they have delivered is fully technology-enabled research process where the user doesn't necessarily need to be concerned with sampling, logistics, reporting, analysis. And the buckets described above are the templates, right, that exists. These are examples of templates that exist in one of our platforms that will enable our stakeholders to eventually self-serve. I was really excited to see democratization of research kind of on the agenda today, because this is all part of that process within my organization of giving and opening up access and capability to our stakeholders to gain direct access, right, to consumer insights in the context, for example, of an agile sprint, right, which is currently how not only our IT team operates, but increasingly our marketing and actuarial product teams are all leveraging those principles of agile to expedite and facilitate a speed to market that is still very new to our very traditional industry. And so what this has looked like for us is really early on in our adoption cycle. Quite frankly, this was something that we did as we were piloting a number of platforms. And so we had an actual live project that, a lot of these platforms say, hey, try us for free and take it for a run and see how it works. And so we leveraged qualitative testing capabilities to get insight from consumers to help us shape an early stage idea that hadn't yet received any kind of business funding. We had literally a simple one-page description of an idea, from the team that we were able to test online in an unmoderated interview format. To give the team working on the concept feedback that came back literally over the lunch hour. Right. So they had put together, like I said, this one pager. We put it out there on the platform. We targeted, at the time they had some hypotheses about who that target market might look like based off of some basic demographics, age and wealth, investable assets, that kind of thing. And we just put it out there with, a short set of questions that said, hey, could you look this over and tell us what you think? Tell us what questions that are coming up for you. Tell us what doesn't make sense that you may need more information on, just to get a pulse on how is this sitting with the folks that we think this could have some appeal for. And we got that feedback, like I said, super fast. And in a format that was engaging, right? We were ultimately able to take the recordings, the actual voice of those consumers, and share it out, with other folks working, on the concept, and/or senior leaders who you are working to gain the funding support for. And given the nature and the economics of these platforms, I could, as a insights consultant, tell them, like, let's do it again, right? Once they've made changes and tweaks and or wanted to try a different angle, like that was the really liberating aspect of all of this, is to not have to have the budget conversation every time they came to us with a question, but rather to say, hey, we've invested in this capacity. We want you to use it. Let's figure out together how to continue to test and learn. That continued to evolve, right? So that was, like I said, one of our first experiences that was incredibly enlightening for me. Obviously, propelled us, down a path of making some investments, dollars that might otherwise have gone to custom projects with vendors, went into funding a set of unlimited testing capacity on these platforms. Like I said, for me, it was an investment in tackling business challenges and problems where we weren't earning our seat at the table. for a variety of reasons. And so over the course of our journey, we continued to experiment, right? I continue to, my researcher mind, and with all of the statistics, I wanted to see, if we were going for something that wasn't as precise, how, what was that gap, right? What did that look like? So I was running tests just to see if we did a full custom study versus iterating on these platforms, how different were the outcomes? What would it take to kind of, close that gap? How do we position that aspect of these platforms, to our stakeholders? And so we continued to experiment, leveraging the tools in a variety of ways. We took a much more experimental approach to concept testing, where normally we might do focus groups, virtual, yes, but focus groups across the country with various audiences. In some cases, parts of the team prior to the pandemic were still flying around the country to sit in on these kinds of discussions, or concept testing, where we were still executing that with our portfolio of vendor partners. And like I said, lots of improvements there on being able to do that kind of work quickly. But we wanted to kind of, really test the process, see what we needed to do differently to really leverage the strengths of the platforms and really maximize what we could do in this kind of new approach. And so one of the first things we did was really kind of plan out, right, the testing iterations, really thinking about things in very small chunks, and conducting much smaller surveys, right, to help inform early stage decision making at the pace at which the decisions were being made. And so instead of saying, hey, that's great, you've got lots of research objectives, we'll come back to you in 6 to 10 weeks, kind of with answers, where in a lot of cases that wasn't a good enough answer anymore. We were saying, okay, give us a couple of days, we'll give you this piece of it, and then we're going to keep going, right? And try to align our timeline to your decision-making timeline. And so as the team moved closer, to presenting their business case, we moved to a hybrid approach, right? So, because as I said, as you're working with the business towards significant dollar investments, the question about precision and certainty does start to shift, right, over the course of that journey. And so the question became, as the team got closer to that, how do we start, to incorporate these tools into, what we might consider more kind of in-depth, robust types of results? And what we found is, we were able to use some of the platforms, and instead of, kind of short 5-minute unmoderated interviews, we were using them to do 60-minute in-depth moderated interviews, where we were just getting quicker, easier access to consumers to do those deep dives. We continue to leverage, our consulting partners, our vendor partners, to actually do facilitation and all those types of things. But we were leveraging the access that we had through the platforms, to do the work that needed to be done. And even on the quant side, we work with a lot of vendors that do those full custom studies for us, but we expedited and facilitated that process, leveraging everything we had learned through the iteration, on the early iteration. And so in much cases, the questionnaire design process had been condensed significantly, because we said, hey, our purpose here, our specific objective is to validate, right, market sizing, opportunity. And so we're going to take these questions where we've been getting iterative feedback over the course of, a period of time, and we're going to consolidate that into a full-blown quant study, so that, time to field and to get results was facilitated by the work that we were doing in the Agile environment. So what have we learned? And many of these will be obvious, right? As I think, I hope that they're best practices that most researchers try to strive for. However, I would say that in an agile process, we have to take a more rigorous approach to things like simplification, consistency and standardization, as well as leveraging language that is super easy to understand. And this is especially challenging in an industry like mine that's brought kind of new dimensions, right, to product complexity, right? We provide a simple benefit, but we often do it with lots of complexity behind it, and we're terrible about not talking about that complexity. And through this kind of research, we've been moving the needle on the language and the education components, and the consumerization of the language within the insurance industry has been a huge outcome from a lot of this type of work. And so, of course, adapting to this experimentation mindset, by taking that test and learn approach and iterating often, using as early as possible in the decision-making cycle, so that teams can build confidence over time. So those are all the things that we learned. And I won't spend too much time on the don'ts, because like I said, I think they go hand in hand. But we also realize that we can't simply shorten, right? This isn't about getting our 30 question surveys down to 10. It's not that simple, right? These platforms don't have the robust capabilities, that a tool like a Qualtrics might have, or things like that, just because, the longer and more complex that you try to make that survey beyond a 3 to 5 question survey, the more errors and problems with execution that we experienced. And so there was a real balance that we had to strike of what is right and appropriate to field on a platform like this. These aren't fully custom studies. We had to break ourselves from our tendency to kind of map out all the objectives and try to cover as much as we could, given that we were making substantial investments. We don't need to do that anymore. We're kind of freed from that financial constraint. So what does that mean to break things down into really small testable chunks that can be woven together, replicated, repeated, that type of thing, I think was a huge learning process for us. And that kind of comes through, right? Don't tackle too much, don't try to do too much, keep it to what is just enough to get us to the next round of testing. We're not saying that these things should be used to drive the $30 million business investment decision. There's still a whole lot of other research tools in the quiver that are more appropriate when that's what's at stake and on the line. But this is a really important component to, like I said, make sure that Insights earns its seat at the table early when, consumer insight, voice of the customer, can have an impact on the actual development and design, and before it gets too far down the path where I often said so much of our work was being putting lipstick on a pig. It was built already, and we had to then use research to position something, whereas this is getting us in much earlier in the process, at least elevating the consumer voice a lot sooner, so that we've got a better opportunity to kind of bridge the gap. And then goes without saying, to remove the corporate jargons and abbreviations, but in our industry that remains kind of one of our most significant challenges is to try to break this all down. So I'm going to end my presentation today just by reiterating that these tools, like I said, are just one piece, not only of the Agile Research Toolkit, but they're only one pillar of a comprehensive insights toolkit. And I hope that you've all gained something today from our learning journey. And I'm happy to address any questions that may have come up. So I don't know, Bill or team, if there's anything that's come through the chat, but happy to take any comments, shared war stories, anything like that from the group.
Hello. All right. Looks like we do have a question or two gathering. Looks like Lisa has, of the agile solutions you explored, which have you found most beneficial?
Yeah. Um, I have to say that we use both of the platforms that we invested in, which were user testing and feedback loop, quite extensively, for very different purposes. I think one of the things that just personally I've enjoyed the most is the user testing platform and the qualitative, because it really did rock my world to get results in over lunch. To have that whole recruiting, and honestly, there's a lot of trade-offs. We have a lot of discussions about, the professional panel member and all of these, but the quality of respondent and the dialogue and discussion that we were having with folks was incredible. Was a really high standard, even in unmoderated interviews. They are screened to be articulate. They're screened to be able to operate in the platform itself, and to give feedback. And as researchers, as users of the platform, we're able to give feedback back to them. We're able to rate them as respondents. We're able to, say, I'm not sure this person met that profile, but that doesn't actually happen that often. And more often than not, these are fantastic, like I said, consumers that are hit the money on target audiences. We've even done some pretty tough recruiting. We've actually done some B2B looking for decision makers, and we have been able to, we've been very comfortable kind of with the quality of respondent that we've been able to find.
Yeah, I wrote down one of your comments, which I loved in the presentation, was leveraging platforms to get the work done. This tendency to just sort of adopt a new platform and accept it as it is or as it's intended is something that I think we as researchers fall victim to too often, right? Being able to adopt new tech and new platforms, but then think of those out of the box ways to use it for your own purposes. I think that can be huge.
Mm-hmm. And to me, it's the fun part, right? We get really creative because every approach and methodology has its pros and cons. And I think the more, the more options that we have from a toolkit perspective, the more that we're able to kind of bring together new combinations of products. Like I said, some of the more exciting projects for us is, when we are able to work with a favorite vendor, right, who we love, their facilitation capabilities, and say, hey, we don't have time to do this over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We've got to get it done this week. But what do you say that you do the moderation? Give me your availability. We'll hook you up. But they still take on that that skill set, which we value, as well as the analysis that we value. But we've expedited the process, cut it by nearly 50%. To me, those are the huge wins that we get when we've got these options at our fingertips.
Yeah, I mean, it blurs the lines between those traditional roles of supplier and client that we all used to neatly fall into. But to the extent that both sides of the fence can be flexible and creative along those lines. Yeah, it's an exciting time to be a researcher.
Yeah.
Let's see. We had another comment that came in from Sophia. Hi, Liz. Thank you so much for sharing your journey, embracing experimentation, and building an agile research process. You said these agile approaches came to the Insights team via your innovation colleagues. Do you experience any initial reluctance from your team or stakeholders to embrace agile research? And if so, how do you overcome it?
100%. Yeah, right. There's always, I think, resistance. There's always skeptics. And there's always the folks that are skeptical of research, period, right? So there's no question that this gives those folks, right, a whole other set of, challenges. And how many people did you really talk to? Is that, you end up back in the old conversations. Whereas you said, if that was the answer we were trying to get, we would be talking in another 5 weeks, well after this thing had been put to bed. Right. So there's a lot of education associated with this. But the thing that I think our business stakeholders found most compelling was, was to get insight so quickly. And, our job was to appropriately position those insights around the conversation and the nature of the decisions that were on deck. Right. And to say, look, as to really encourage folks to continue to say, like, if there was still uncertainty and still areas that, let's use this, as input into a full-blown conjoint trade-off study that we're going to do at this point in the day. Well, that's going to take too long. Well, we've gotten this far. But if you want to be fully confident, before we file, that SEC application, then let's get that study done. We'll do that. We'll get it kicked off here. You won't get it back till October, November, but it'll come in before you make that filing, even though I know that team was working to finalize the details well before that filing had to take care of. And if we weren't there at that table at that time, then that thing was going without any input from us. And so balancing those two kinds of objectives, is the art, I think, that we're still learning with our partners to, like I said, use this oftentimes to build a case to make investments in further research.
So Agile is very much a process, right? Any failures along the way or broken eggs that have allowed you to make this omelet that you'd like to share, lessons learned that you sort of picked up?
Oh yeah. Yeah, like I said, this presentation actually came out of kind of a checkpoint, that I did with my team, probably about a year, 18 months in, because not only was this new to me, this was new to my entire team. We were rebuilding a team at the time, right? So we were hiring new folks, we're introducing everyone to this and throwing them into the mix. And at some point, I kind of checked back in and said, okay, like, how is this working? And, and what I saw was a lot of traditional approaches that we were trying to squeeze into these new methods. And so, one of the things that we found, especially in the quant testing, was just a lot of error, right? A lot of fielding mistakes, right? That the vendor was having, certainly from a technology startup perspective, there's always kind of a, degree of variability there, but certainly the more complexity that we were bringing to the table from a design perspective, because like I said, they were built to deal with the non-researcher, right? So things couldn't have been more simple. Like when they said 3 to 5 questions, they meant 3 to 5 questions. Like forget all of your display logic, your screener. Like they were like, why are you asking me to do this? That's not normally what we do. So we pushed the limits of their capability because we wanted them to meet us somewhere. And in that process, there was mistakes, there were errors, there was the need to kind of redo to the point that you could look back and say, was that actually faster than doing it the old way? I'm not sure. So there was a lot of that, and breaking down kind of those old paradigms, right, of design and fielding and expectations around all of that is a challenge, right? Like you've got to really experiment with what's going to work. And I think boiling it down, right? I think a lot of my team is used to, getting a whole laundry list of research objectives and trying to cover as much as possible, right? In a survey or in a dialogue, because you're in that world, you're maximizing the value of your investment. Whereas this is a completely different economic model where you're investing in the capacity to be able to do it again and again and again. And so you don't need to be comprehensive. And in fact, you need to think small and think about repeating and or iterating in order to, in order to really be making the most of the platform. Because one of the things we learned after the first year is we didn't use nearly the kind of capacity that I'd wanted to on the platforms, because what we were doing was too big. Right? We were doing like what turned into mini studies that required a whole set of analysis and stuff on its own, and turned into like mini custom projects where I'm just like, we've got to push it even further to where, our stakeholders can consume the insights because it is that simple. And so that is an absolute work in progress that is going to be continuously evaluated and improved, because it, like I said, it doesn't come natural.
Right. Yeah, I mean, especially for someone who is, the classically trained researcher, this is a difficult thing to sort of wrap your head around and adapt. But you said it. I mean, it is very much, it's an ongoing process. And you get there eventually, or you keep striving to get there.
That's right. Striving, right? There's so much, that's where all the learning happens, is we're trying to get there. I'm not sure that we ever will, but like I said, we've got a lot more options to and our time to deliver has been incredible. And that conversation that I'm having with senior leaders, this got attention at the C-level suite, which I thought was amazing. I think it was the first research method process conversation that we ever had with our CEO. And so that alone, was motivating, right? That it was getting people's attention, that we had a lot of top-down support for where we were moving, because it aligned to kind of broader enterprise strategic objectives around agility. And so all of that, definitely contributed to our ability to gain support for this, even though, like I said, in practice, in the field, there's still a lot of, challenging questions and skepticism that you've got to, that you've got to work through. But the ability, like I said, to deliver the voice of the consumer to the table when the decision making matters most is, I think that's what everybody's been super receptive to.
And along those lines, Rachel actually had a question. Any tips for getting stakeholders on board and joining the research conversation earlier?
Yeah, no, that's, my team will say it's not always, the easiest thing. And sometimes, as we were still demonstrating these values, is particularly in organizations that, quite frankly, had written us off, right? That they weren't doing this. They had a pretty strong perspective about how valuable consumer insight was to their processes. And so, it took some work and some collaboration and partnership, talking about resetting expectations about okay, you're in an agile process, you're moving really, really fast. But if you, include us, right, in those agile sprint meetings on a weekly basis, we will, do what we can, right, to feed to you feedback through that process. And, it was a real challenge. I'm not sure that I would recommend it again, because, working, in this case, it was working with a bunch of actuaries who were highly technical, asking questions that we knew, quite frankly, consumers wouldn't understand, right? And, they're always so reliant on the fact, oh, well, an advisor will explain this. But having done 10 years of B2B research, I knew no, advisors actually can't. It's they're not experts, they're not specialists in our products, and they don't know it like you know it, and why we're putting, all these kinds of things. And so that in and of itself was a productive dialogue. But like I said, I think being able to come back week to week to that table with some insights that help them evaluate the levers they were shifting and the kind of changes you were making, I think did open the doors to further conversation. So that was the big win. Still a lot of skepticism, still a lot of healthy dialogue about what's the best approach to gather insight to inform the decision. But in that particular instance, the platforms, certainly my team members earned their seat at that table.
We have a comment from John along these very same lines. Comes down to recognizing and supporting leadership, which has the humility to acknowledge they don't know everything and are open to research. It can be a baby, and you've got a receptive organization, Liz. There are some who would be very closed off to such things, and it is very much a baby step and proof point type of process.
Yeah. I no question that the broader enterprise dialogue around agility, design thinking, that was something that all the senior executives were going through. And quite frankly, one of in those first rounds of conversations that I did as I stepped into the consumer insights role, I was talking to one of my key stakeholders in the distribution organization who said, Liz, why do I need this when I can go down to Starbucks and talk to 10 people and get input? And I'm like, oh my God. I don't want the head of our distribution going down to Starbucks and like taking a poll of 10 people and making a decision. So but that was the culture. There was already a real receptivity to the need to do things faster. I think though where it became very compelling was when I was able to show them what we could do, how much we could do for the same cost as one custom study. So, my budget is a consulting budget. And so we have almost all the consulting dollars in our marketing organization goes and has been historically used for third-party vendors and things like that. And quite frankly, we used a very small chunk of it to get unlimited testing capacity. And so the amount of our ability, right, to like I said, remove budget from the conversation with our stakeholders and just free them to come to us with questions in and of itself was really important to our business, the growth and the scaling of this process.
Yeah. And when you can make it attractive to the purse strings, that's always a good thing, for sure.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, just last check. I think that does it for Q&A. Liz,
Great.
you kicked us off. Great job. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Any parting shots?
No, just thanks again to you and your team for the opportunity for us to share, and really looking forward to the rest of the agenda today, because I think it all is in this kind of same evolution, and love to hear from kind of where others are. Really excited about the next session on crowdsourcing, because that might be our next frontier. So
awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, audience, give us about 5 minutes. Everybody check your email, grab a beverage. We will circle back in a few. Thanks a lot, Liz.
thank you.